Today's lesson is about testing for positive ions using precipitate formation. The precipitation tests for metal ions are based on the fact that most metal hydroxides are insoluble. Some are also colored and are therefore easily identified. Now let us start with testing for copper 2 ions. When copper 2 salt is added to sodium hydroxide solution, a light blue precipitate of copper hydroxide is formed. When adding the alkali, add it slowly at first, one drop at a time. If it is added too quickly, it is easy to miss a precipitate that redissolves in excess. In the case of copper 2 ions, the blue precipitate remains insoluble when excess sodium hydroxide is added to it. Now, testing for iron 2 ions. When iron 2 salt is added to sodium hydroxide solution, a dirty green precipitate of iron 2 hydroxide is formed. The precipitate is insoluble in excess sodium hydroxide solution. Testing for chromium 3 ions. When chromium 3 salt is added to sodium hydroxide, a green precipitate of chromium 3 hydroxide is formed. The precipitate dissolves in excess of sodium hydroxide solution to form a green solution. Both iron 2 ions and chromium form green precipitate, but in the case of chromium hydroxide, it dissolves in excess sodium hydroxide to give a green solution. In the case of iron 2 ions, the green precipitate does not dissolve in excess sodium hydroxide. Testing for iron 3 ions. When iron 3 salt is added to sodium hydroxide, a rust brown precipitate of iron 3 hydroxide is formed. It is insoluble in excess sodium hydroxide. Some ions produce white precipitate. Calcium, aluminium and zinc ions form white precipitate with sodium hydroxide solution. Testing for calcium ions. When aqueous sodium hydroxide is added to calcium ions, a white precipitate of calcium hydroxide is formed. The precipitate is insoluble in excess sodium hydroxide solution. Testing for aluminium ions. When aqueous sodium hydroxide is added to aluminium ions, a white precipitate of aluminium hydroxide is formed. The precipitate is soluble in excess sodium hydroxide solution, giving a colorless solution. Testing for zinc ion. When aqueous sodium hydroxide is added to zinc ions, a white precipitate of zinc hydroxide is formed. The precipitate is soluble in excess sodium hydroxide, giving a colorless solution. Both zinc and aluminium ions form a colorless solution with excess sodium hydroxide. Then how do we differentiate between zinc and aluminium ions? The test is repeated again with ammonia solution. When ammonia solution is added to zinc ions, a white precipitate of zinc hydroxide is formed. When excess ammonia is added, the precipitate dissolves to give a colorless solution. In the case of aluminium, when excess ammonia is added, the white precipitate does not dissolve. And this is how we differentiate between zinc and aluminium ions. It is important to learn these tests because you will not have a copy of them in the written examination, where questions often need knowledge of these tests. And you will find questions of this type in paper 6 of the IGCSE exam paper. Thank you.